He was on the verge of changing his life forever, a young black student with everything to gain. But one decision, one sacrifice, and one lost child would send him on a path far greater than the one he thought he wanted. On the cusp of adulthood and ambition, Jalen Carter had been preparing for this day for years. 19 years old, sharp-minded and raised on resolve, he was the embodiment of perseverance, a product of modest beginnings in a weather-worn community on the city's east side. Jalen was no stranger to responsibility. He had grown up balancing academics with after-school jobs, managing his time between tutoring younger students and caring for his ailing grandmother while his mother worked night shifts. What made this day so different and so important was that it represented not just an opportunity, but a turning point. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jalen had earned a rare interview with the prestigious Raymond Ellison Foundation, a private program that offered full academic scholarships to underrepresented students pursuing engineering and architecture. It was the kind of opportunity that turned blueprints into buildings and dreams into degrees. One interview, one chance, a shot at becoming the first in his family to attend college. The air was crisp that morning, carrying the faint scent of wet concrete and city grit. It had rained the night before, leaving small puddles that reflected the golden hues of dawn. Dressed in his best outfit, pressed slacks, a tucked-in dress shirt, and a navy windbreaker, Jalen moved through the city streets with measured urgency. His stride was confident, his steps fast but composed, fueled by the adrenaline of purpose. His backpack was light, carrying only the essentials, a portfolio, his transcript, letters of recommendation, and a laminated copy of his resume. But the weight he carried inside was heavier, the unspoken pressure of a mother who had sacrificed too much, of neighbors who'd pinned their hopes on him, and of a community longing for proof that escape was possible. The university was just 4 blocks away when something unusual caught his attention. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a small figure in the corner of his eye. But as he turned his head, time seemed to slow. There, near the edge of a busy intersection, stood a young boy, no older than 5 or 6. The child was in pajamas, barefoot, his curly hair flattened on one side as if he had just risen from bed. His tiny frame looked dwarfed by the towering vehicles rushing by, and his gaze was vacant, wide eyes scanning the chaos as if lost in a dream he couldn't wake from. No adult was nearby. Jalen's breath hitched in his throat. The child stood less than 3 feet from the curb, his toes inches from the street where cars zipped past without hesitation. Drivers didn't see him. Pedestrians didn't notice. The world moved on, indifferent and unaware. Jalen stopped cold. A storm of thoughts surged through him. He still had time. The interview wasn't far. He could call someone. Maybe someone else would handle it. A passerby, a patrol officer, anyone more equipped. But then the boy took one small step forward. Instinct overrode reason. Jalen sprinted. His sneakers splashed through a shallow puddle as he surged toward the child, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the screech of tires or the distant horn that followed. In one swift, decisive motion, he reached out, wrapped his arms around the child, and yanked him away from the curb just as a delivery van hurtled past, its wind rattling Jalen's jacket as it missed them by inches. They tumbled onto the damp sidewalk, Jalen shielding the boy with his body. For a moment, both were still, The child clung to him, silent except for the tremble in his shoulders. Jalen held him tightly, steadying his own breath while trying to calm the shaking figure in his arms. In the chaotic calm that followed, Jalen slowly sat up and scanned the surroundings. Still, there was no one searching, no frantic parent in sight. The city roared on as if nothing had happened. For everyone else, it was just another Tuesday morning. The boy, dazed and scared, muttered a name, Cameron. His speech was slow, uncertain. He couldn't say where he lived, didn't know how he got there. All he remembered was that his front door was open and he was trying to find his father. It was a child's logic, heartbreakingly simple and dangerously misguided. Jalen stood up, gently helping Cameron to his feet. He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and checked the time. 26 a.m., 4 minutes to go. He could still run. Maybe, just maybe, he could explain. He could say there had been a delay, an emergency. He could leave the boy with a local shopkeeper or ask someone nearby to wait with him. But then the child looked up, eyes wide and wet, searching Jalen's face for reassurance. In that moment, Jalen didn't see a distraction or a delay. He saw his younger self, lost, vulnerable, looking for someone to care. He unlocked his phone and called emergency services. 15 minutes later, the red and blue lights of a patrol vehicle lit the intersection. Officer Hernandez, a young, focused officer with warm eyes, stepped out and approached them. She knelt beside the boy and spoke in a gentle tone. Within moments, she confirmed the boy had been reported missing just 30 minutes earlier by his frantic father. Jalen gave his statement clearly, recounting everything from the moment he saw Cameron to the near accident. He declined any further attention, brushing off her praise. He was more concerned with the time. It was now 8:01 a.m. He was officially over 30 minutes late to the most important opportunity of his life. As he turned to leave, the officer called out, "You did something. Incredible today, you know." Jalen nodded, offered a faint smile, and kept walking. When he arrived at the admissions building, the polished glass facade reflected his weary face back at him. He stepped inside, the air-conditioned lobby sterile and pristine. Behind the front desk, a receptionist barely looked up. He introduced himself, quietly explained the delay, and asked if the board was still available. "They've already moved on," she replied curtly, her eyes returning to the monitor. Jalen nodded. He thanked her and left. Outside, the streets bustled. The world moved forward, indifferent to the choice he had made. For a moment, Jalen felt an emptiness, not of regret, but of uncertainty. Had he made the right decision? Would his sacrifice be worth it? Then, as he turned to head home, a black SUV pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down, and a voice, calm, deep, unmistakably resolute, called out, "Are you Jalen Carter?" Startled, Jalen turned to face the man who would soon change his life forever. The SUV idled beside the curb, sleek and silent. The tinted window was lowered halfway, revealing a man dressed in a charcoal-grey suit, crisp shirt, and a patterned tie that hinted at wealth, not just worn, but woven into his life. His salt-and-pepper hair was cropped neatly, his voice steady yet laced with urgency. "Are you Jalen Carter?" the man repeated. Jalen blinked, still catching his breath from the whirlwind of the morning. He nodded cautiously. "My name is Charles Bennett. I'm Cameron's father." The weight of the moment shifted in Jalen's chest. He stepped forward slightly, now realizing he was face to face with the man whose child he had rescued Not even an hour ago. There was a pause between them, not awkward but charged. Bennett stepped out of the car. He was taller than Jalen expected, with the kind of presence that seemed to fill a space before he even spoke. But his expression was not stern. It was one of gratitude, tinted with disbelief. The kind of look a man wears when he realizes someone else saved the most precious thing in his world. "I've been searching everywhere," Bennett continued, voice cracking slightly. "The police told me what you did. You pulled my son off the street. You probably saved his life." Jalen, ever humble, simply nodded again. "He was alone," he said quietly. "I just did what anyone would have done." But Bennett shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "Not everyone would have risked everything. Not everyone would have stopped, especially not on the most important day of their life." Jalen glanced down at his shoes, still damp from the morning's rain. In his hand, his resume was crumpled. The weight of the missed interview began to settle in, the sense that he might have just watched the door to his future quietly close behind him. But the man in front of him had a different idea. "Get in the car," Bennett said. "We need to talk." As they drove through the city, Jalen sat upright in the leather passenger seat, unsure of what to say or expect. The interior was plush, quiet, insulated from the buzz of the outside world. Bennett's phone rang twice. Messages came in rapid succession, but he ignored them all. His focus remained entirely on Jalen. "Tell me about yourself," he finally asked, eyes on the road but curiosity genuine. "Where are you from? What are you working toward?" Jalen hesitated for a moment, unsure if this was still real, but then he began to speak, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. He spoke of the East End neighborhood where he was raised, a place defined as much by its resilience as its poverty. He described his mother, Lorraine, a night nurse who worked doubles for most of his childhood to make ends meet. He told him about his grandmother, the real matriarch of the family, who had instilled in him the values of discipline and kindness through stories and silent strength. He shared that his father had left when he was just 5 years old, a vague figure who only existed now in the form of faded photographs and fading memories. That absence, Jalen said, taught him early how to become a man, not by age, but by action. He had always known that his only path out was through education. While others found escape in shortcuts or silence, Jalen had buried himself in books, often studying by candlelight during power outages. He had been tutoring younger kids in math and science since he was 14, not for money, but to give back to the same community that raised him. His dream wasn't fame or wealth. It was architecture, not just designing buildings, but rebuilding neighborhoods, starting with his own. He wanted to return to the East End one day and reimagine it not as a place to escape from, but a place to aspire to. "That's why the interview today meant so much," Jalen concluded. "It was for a foundation scholarship, full ride. I missed it." Bennett was quiet for a moment, absorbing every word. He glanced briefly at Jalen, a newfound respect growing in his eyes. "You remind me of someone I used to be," he finally said, "before life pulled me in other directions." As the car slowed in front of an upscale office building in the heart of downtown, Jalen looked up, confused. "We're not finished," Bennett said. "I want you to come inside with me." The building was sleek and modern, a polished symbol of corporate power. As they entered, security gave Bennett a respectful nod. Executives and assistants moved aside without question. Jalen followed, unsure of what was happening, but too intrigued to ask. They rode the elevator to the top floor. The doors opened to a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the city skyline. Inside, several men and women in business attire sat at a long table, engaged in a meeting. Bennett walked in without pause. "Sorry to interrupt," he announced, "but I need 5 minutes of your time. Everyone, this is Jalen Carter. He just saved my son's life." All heads turned. Jalen stood frozen at the door, unsure of where to look, but Bennett's tone gave no room for embarrassment. It wasn't a plea. It was a declaration. He turned to Jalen. "Show them what you brought." With hesitant hands, Jalen pulled his crumpled resume and portfolio from his backpack. Someone cleared space on the table. Another person called for coffee. Within seconds, the boardroom transformed from a business meeting into a silent interview panel. As Jalen began explaining his designs, the tension melted away. His passion flowed effortlessly. He spoke of community-first planning, of sustainable housing for low-income neighborhoods, of parks that healed generational divides. What had begun as a lost opportunity was now taking new shape, not as an interview, but a moment of recognition. He wasn't just a candidate. He was a force of integrity, vision, and quiet power. When he finished, the room applauded. Not out of politeness, but out of genuine admiration. Charles Bennett stepped forward. "For those who don't know," he said to the group, "I'm not just a father. I'm also the founder and primary benefactor of the Raymond Ellison Foundation." Jalen's breath caught. "I think we just found someone who represents everything this foundation was created for." That evening, Jalen returned home not just with a story, but with a new chapter unfolding. He wasn't just a boy from the East End anymore. He was the young man who had saved a life, spoken his truth, and earned a future through character alone. The world hadn't ignored his sacrifice. It had embraced it. The next morning, the East End neighborhood seemed brighter than usual. Not because the sun shone any stronger, but because of the way the world now looked through Jalen's eyes. For the first time in months, maybe even years, he felt the hum of possibility in his chest. Something deep and steady, something real. He had barely slept, too stunned by everything that had unfolded the day before. The meeting in that glass-walled boardroom still played over in his mind like a vivid dream. It was as if the moment he acted on instinct, when he ran into the street to save a child, the universe had noticed. For so long, Jalen had done the right things without expecting applause, and now, out of nowhere, the world was clapping. But it wasn't just about recognition. It was something deeper than that. It was respect, and it had begun spreading like wildfire. By noon, the story was everywhere. College student saves child from traffic, gains life-changing opportunity. The headlines were circulating on local news sites, Twitter threads, and even talk radio. A grainy cell phone video, recorded by a nearby delivery driver, showed the moment Jalen had rushed into the intersection and snatched Cameron Bennett from harm's way. You could see the hesitation in traffic, the honk, the screech, the split-second lunge, then silence before a stranger's voice murmured, "That kid just saved that boy's life." The footage wasn't long, but it was powerful. Even more powerful was the follow-up image. Jalen standing in the boardroom, unpolished but proud, presenting his work with rolled-up sleeves and unmatched shoes. The contrast was striking. It captured everything that mattered: heart, courage, and character, all without a single word spoken. Back home, Jalen Carter stood by the kitchen window with her hands still damp from dishes. blinking away tears. Her son hadn't told her everything the night before. He didn't want to make a big deal of it, but now the whole city seemed to be celebrating what she had always known, that Jalen was rare. Special, yes, but not just for his mind or ambition. It was his instinct to serve, to do good without fanfare, to step forward even when the world stepped back. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Co-workers, church members, neighbors who hadn't spoken in months. One of them sent her a screenshot from a national news network. Jalen's name was now trending. "You raised a hero," one message read. She clutched the phone tightly and whispered to herself, "No, he raised himself." Elsewhere, in the offices of the Raymond Ellison Foundation, a storm of activity had begun. Charles Bennett, still emotionally stirred from the events, had called an emergency meeting with his team. "I want Jalen Carter onboarded. Immediately," he said, looking each person in the eye. "Not next month, not after the process, now." One of the executives raised a hand. "Sir, our scholarship deadlines—" Bennett didn't raise his voice, but the firmness in his tone silenced the room. "What that young man did has more weight than 1,000 applications. If we're truly a foundation that rewards merit and service, then there's no clearer choice. Fast-track him." It wasn't just about charity. It wasn't even just gratitude. For Bennett, who had spent his career surrounded by transactional people in boardrooms and balance sheets, Jalen represented something increasingly rare: principle. That day, Jalen received a formal letter of offer. "Mr. Jalen Carter, the Raymond Ellison Foundation, is honored to offer you a full academic scholarship, including tuition, housing, a technology stipend, and a mentorship program tailored to your field of study. We believe in not just rewarding brilliance, but uplifting those who make this world better. Welcome to your future." Jalen sat in his bedroom, rereading the letter over and over. It wasn't just the opportunity that moved him. It was the fact that someone saw him, not as a statistic, not as a charity case, but as someone who deserved to be in the room, and the ripple effects kept growing. By the weekend, community leaders reached out. Churches requested he come speak to their youth groups. A high school guidance counselor from his old school asked if he could mentor a group of at-risk students once a month. Even a local architect, someone Jalen had once admired from afar, offered to let him shadow projects over the summer. He was no longer invisible. He had become a symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility. And yet, Jalen didn't let it go to his head. He still woke up at 6, still helped his grandmother with her medicine, still volunteered at the after-school center 3 blocks down. He understood something most people didn't, that heroism wasn't a title you earned. It was a choice you made every day in the quiet spaces when no one was watching. One evening, as he walked back from the corner store, he spotted a group of young boys tossing a football near the cracked basketball court. One of them dropped it, and it rolled toward him. Jalen bent down, picked it up, and passed it back with a flick of his wrist. "You the guy from the news?" one of them asked. Jalen smiled, nodding slightly. "You famous now?" "Nah," Jalen said, shrugging. "Just did the right thing at the right time." The boy paused. "You think I could do that?" Jalen looked at him, skinny, uncertain, eyes full of untamed dreams, and said, "You already can. Just be ready when the moment finds you." Back at home, he kept a folder by his bedside. Inside were 2 things: the acceptance letter from the foundation and a printed photo of Cameron Bennett, the little boy he had saved. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder that in a world obsessed with results, it's the quiet decisions that shape everything. The next part of his journey was only beginning, but the first victory had already been won. Not just the scholarship, not the headlines, but the undeniable proof that character still mattered. That doing the right thing wasn't just noble, it was transformative. Change has a way of creeping in slowly, like the tide, until one day you realize the shoreline is completely different. In the weeks following the incident, Jalen Carter began to see this change in his own life, not in abrupt, dramatic waves, but in the quiet, unmistakable way the world began to respond to him. At first, it was all positive. Supportive messages flooded in from people he had never met. Professors, non-profit leaders, even public figures began referencing him in speeches and social posts, calling him a beacon of moral leadership for the next generation. But with that praise came something more complex. Expectation. He'd once been an anonymous college student struggling to balance odd jobs, coursework, and family obligations. Now he was being invited to sit on panels, featured in scholarship spotlights, and offered internships with powerful firms that would never have looked twice at him just a month ago. The Raymond Ellison Foundation had arranged a full onboarding package. They assigned him a mentor, a polished executive named Maya Trenton, whose presence alone could command a room. She took a liking to Jalen immediately. Smart, articulate, grounded. "You remind me of myself," she said during their first lunch together. "But let me tell you something most won't. The moment people see potential in you, they'll try to shape you." Jalen blinked, unsure if it was a compliment or a warning. "You're walking into rooms that weren't designed for people like us," she added, stirring her tea. "Learn the language, play the game, but don't let them define you." It was good advice. Advice he didn't yet realize he'd need so soon. Within the Foundation's inner circle, Jalen quickly became a topic of both admiration and concern. Some praised him as authentic and visionary. Others weren't so sure. "He's great PR, but is he scalable?" whispered one executive during a board meeting. "Can he adapt to our standards?" "He doesn't dress the part," said another, subtly referencing Jalen's thrift store, shirts and worn sneakers. Charles Bennett shut down the conversation with a single raised hand. "We're not here to make him palatable to us," Bennett said. "We're here to make our system more accessible to him, and to everyone like him." Still, Jalen could feel the quiet scrutiny wherever he went. When he spoke at a youth leadership forum, half the panelists praised his humility. The other half offered thinly veiled suggestions that he refine his professional image and work on executive polish. He hadn't changed, but their perception of him had. And with that perception came a subtle shifting of power. Even back at campus, the shift was palpable. Professors who once brushed off his ideas now sought his input. Former classmates who never acknowledged him were suddenly eager to collaborate. Administrators placed him on committees. One even hinted that he could be a candidate for a major student award that, until now, had never been within his reach. But while doors were opening, so were new traps. He was no longer invisible, which meant every step he took was being watched. The community expected him to stay humble. The Foundation expected him to be polished. The city expected him to be inspirational, and Jalen, still just trying to figure out who he was, felt the weight of it all. One afternoon, Maya pulled him aside after a meeting. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine," he replied. "No, you're not. You're adapting too fast. You're trying to become what everyone needs you to be. That's a dangerous path. Jalen looked down at his hands. I don't want to mess this up. Not for my mom. Not for the kids who look up to me now. Maya softened. Then be careful, because the world doesn't just reward heroes, it uses them, until they burn out or fall out of line. Meanwhile, the foundation had begun, planning its annual gala, a black-tie event that drew CEOs, politicians, and philanthropists from around the country. Charles Bennett insisted that Jalen be the keynote speaker. Your story is our mission in motion, Bennett said. You represent what this foundation stands for. Jalen nodded, but deep down, he felt like a mannequin being dressed for a storefront window. The pressure to perform, to inspire, to be perfect, it was mounting. He spent hours rehearsing, not just his speech, but every movement, every expression. He got fitted for a rented tuxedo, practiced his handshake, studied videos on posture and tone. On the night of the gala, he looked every bit the part. And yet, as he stood behind the curtain waiting for his cue, his stomach churned. Because somewhere between the rescue on the street and the ballroom spotlight, the simplicity of why he had acted was being buried under the image of what he had become. But when he stepped on stage and faced the crowd, the chandeliers, the cameras, the rows of well-dressed power players, something inside him settled. He took a breath, and he remembered the boy's eyes. Cameron, frightened, alone, inches from tragedy. That was real. Everything else was just noise. So, instead of the polished script, Jalen spoke from the heart. I didn't plan to become a symbol, he began. I just saw a kid in danger and ran. I did what I hope anyone would do. He paused. And maybe that's the problem. That doing the right thing feels exceptional now, when it should be normal. The room went quiet. I'm not here because I'm special. I'm here because I got lucky. Lucky that someone with power saw me. But there are hundreds of others like me, still waiting to be seen. What will you do when you see them? Applause rose, slow, then thunderous. In that moment, Jalen reclaimed his voice, not the foundation's voice, not the public's narrative. His voice. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted for him, it had shifted because of him. The aftermath of the gala speech left Jalen with a strange feeling, a mix of relief and a quiet urgency. The applause, the flashing cameras, the buzz in the room, they were all echoes of a moment that had passed. What lingered was the question, now what? That night, as he lay on the worn mattress in his small bedroom, staring at the cracked ceiling, Jalen realized the journey ahead was not about spotlight moments. It was about connection, about weaving together the two worlds he now inhabited, the neighborhood that shaped him and the world that was just beginning to open its doors. Jalen's East End neighborhood was a patchwork of memories, challenges, and dreams. The streets where he'd learned to ride his bike, the corner store where he'd traded stories with old Mr. Jenkins, the basketball courts scarred by years of use. These places were home. They were constant, unyielding. But home was also a place that sometimes seemed trapped in its own struggle. Jobs were scarce, opportunities fewer, and hope often deferred. Jalen knew that if he was going to honor the chance given to him, he had to stay rooted, not just physically but emotionally and socially. The first step was to reconnect with his community in a deeper way. He began volunteering more regularly at the local after-school center, where he had spent countless afternoons growing up. The kids were familiar faces now, some curious about his recent rise, others skeptical. "Why'd you even bother coming back?" one boy asked during a basketball game, the question sharp as a defender's steel. Jalen paused, ball in hand. He wasn't sure how to explain the complicated mix of gratitude and responsibility that pulled him here. "Because this is home," he said simply. "And because if I'm going to make it, I want to make sure you all can too." That was enough for the kid to nod, a small victory in itself. Meanwhile, Jalen worked hard to balance the demands of his scholarship and the expectations that came with it. He found himself attending more meetings, networking events, and mentoring sessions than he had imagined. There were lectures on leadership, seminars on social justice, and workshops on entrepreneurship. Each one was a window into a world that was as exciting as it was intimidating. He appreciated the chance to learn, but he also felt the subtle pressure to change, to soften his edges, to smooth his speech, to fit a mold that wasn't quite his own. But Jalen was determined to resist losing himself. When Maya Trenton suggested he join a corporate internship program at a tech company, he hesitated. "I'm grateful for the opportunity," he told her one afternoon, "but I want to find a way to use what I'm learning to help my neighborhood, not just climb a ladder that's built on someone else's terms." Maya smiled, impressed. "That kind of vision is rare. Just remember, sometimes the ladder and the bridge can be the same thing." Jalen took her words to heart. He began looking for ways to connect his studies with real change back home. He started a project with the local library, organizing digital literacy workshops for teens who didn't have computers or internet access. He recruited classmates from his college to volunteer. Soon, the program was running twice a week, with a growing number of eager participants. As the weeks passed, Jalen also started attending community meetings. These gatherings were often tense, residents frustrated by lack of resources, distrustful of politicians and outsiders, wary of promises that never came true. Jalen spoke up, not as a savior, but as someone who understood the pain and the hope. "We have to stop waiting for someone else to fix things," he told the group. "We have to start with what we have, what we can do." Some nodded, some remained skeptical, but a spark had been lit. One evening, after a particularly charged meeting, Jalen walked home with Lorraine. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "You're doing more than just making a name for yourself. You're giving people hope." Jalen shrugged. "I'm just trying to do what's right. But sometimes I wonder if I'm stretching myself too thin." Lorraine smiled. "That's the sign of someone who cares." Outside of community work, Jalen's relationships also grew more complex. His friendship with Cameron Bennett, the boy he saved, deepened beyond the initial rescue. Cameron's family had opened their home to Jalen like an extended family. They saw in him a role model, a brother figure, someone who had stepped into their lives at a moment of crisis and stayed. Charles Bennett, Cameron's father, made it clear that Jalen was welcome at their family dinners and holidays. "You're part of this family now," Charles said once during a quiet moment. "Not because of what you did, but because of who you are." Yet, with this new closeness came new tensions. Charles was a powerful man, a CEO with a sharp mind and a sharper business instinct. He had certain expectations. He wanted Jalen to succeed on the world's terms, to be polished, professional, and prepared to take on leadership roles in business and philanthropy. At times, Jalen felt the weight of those expectations like chains. One afternoon, while reviewing an internship offer from one of Charles's associates, Jalen confessed his concerns. "I don't want to lose sight of why I'm here," he said. "I want to grow, yes, but I don't want to forget where I came from or who I'm trying to serve." Charles nodded thoughtfully. That balance is hard to find, but it's also what makes leaders great. Those who remember their roots while reaching for the stars. Meanwhile, at college, Jalen's circle expanded. He met students from different backgrounds, some wealthy, some struggling like him, and slowly built friendships that crossed lines he'd never imagined crossing. In these new relationships, he learned about privilege and power from new perspectives, but he also shared stories from his neighborhood that opened eyes and hearts. Through these exchanges, Jalen discovered the real power of connection, the way stories, empathy, and shared dreams could break down walls. Yet with every new bridge built, Jalen faced the pull of two different worlds. At a formal dinner hosted by the foundation, surrounded by elites discussing policy and investment, Jalen felt both included and out of place. Later that night, walking home through his neighborhood's cracked sidewalks, he heard the laughter of children playing in the street. Those sounds grounded him, reminded him why the struggle was worth it. He wasn't just building a future for himself, he was building a legacy for those who would come after. One day, during a quiet moment at the library workshop, a young girl named Mia approached him. "Mr. Carter, do you think I can go to college one day?" Her eyes were wide with hope and something else, fear. Jalen knelt to her level and smiled. "Yes, Mia, you can, and I'll be here to help make sure you get there." In these moments, small, unscripted and real, Jalen found the heart of his journey. Integration wasn't about losing parts of himself to fit in. It was about bringing all parts of himself to the table: the scholar, the neighbor, the son, the leader, the friend. Connection wasn't just a network or a title. It was a lifeline. And as the months went on, Jalen's world grew richer, not just because of new opportunities, but because he was learning to weave them into a tapestry of hope, resilience, and purpose. But this delicate balance was fragile. Not everyone was pleased to see a young black student rise so quickly, with so much attention. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of jealousy, suspicion, and old prejudices cloaked in polite. In conversation, Jalen knew that the real test of his character was still ahead. He sat on his bedroom floor one night, surrounded by textbooks and letters of recommendation, and thought about how far he'd come. The lost child he saved had changed his life forever. But the story wasn't just about a rescue. It was about what comes next. Because saving a life wasn't enough. Now Jalen had to live that life fully, with integrity, humility, and courage. He was no longer just a survivor of circumstance. He was a builder of futures. Jalen's rise from the streets of his East End neighborhood to the polished lecture halls and grand networking events of his scholarship world had been nothing short of remarkable. But as his life expanded into new spaces, so too did his awareness of the deeper, unseen forces shaping the world around him. What once seemed like a straightforward path to success and change was now a labyrinth of systemic barriers and entrenched interests, forces that didn't just test his resolve, but challenged everything he thought he knew. It all started with a guest lecture that left a mark deeper than any applause or accolade ever could. Dr. Helena Morris was a renowned scholar of social justice and public policy, invited to speak about educational equity and structural racism. Her words pierced through the comfortable narratives many clung to about meritocracy and equal opportunity. Jalen sat near the front of the auditorium, his eyes fixed on Dr. Morris as she detailed the harsh realities behind the statistics. How underfunding of schools in neighborhoods like his wasn't a coincidence, but the result of decades of discriminatory policies, zoning laws, and political neglect. She explained how redlining, the practice of denying loans or insurance to residents of certain areas based on race or ethnicity, had crippled communities and deprived generations of wealth-building opportunities. She showed charts illustrating the stark disparities in school budgets between affluent districts and those serving primarily black and low-income students. As Dr. Morris spoke, Jalen felt the puzzle pieces of his own experience, the worn-down basketball courts, the overcrowded classrooms, the lack of resources, snapped together into a bigger picture. It was both liberating and infuriating. He stayed after the lecture, waiting in line with others to speak to her. "Why do people pretend this isn't happening?" Jalen asked. "Why don't they just fix it?" Dr. Morris looked at him with a mixture of kindness and steel in her eyes. "Because change threatens power," she said. "Those in control have no incentive to disrupt the system that benefits them. It takes people like you, those who have lived these realities, to demand justice and force change." Her words lit a fire inside Jalen that nothing could extinguish. Determined to understand more, Jalen threw himself into research. He spent hours in the college library, poring over reports on educational funding, housing policies, and economic inequalities. He explored data on graduation rates, college enrollment, and youth unemployment in his city. He met with local educators who shared first-hand accounts of how cuts to programs, arts, tutoring, counseling, had left students without critical support. He learned about community activists who had fought, and sometimes lost, battles for fair housing and decent jobs. Each new fact, each new story, reinforced what he had sensed all along. The problems his neighborhood faced were not isolated, but part of a larger system designed to keep certain people and places behind. But Jalen didn't just want to know the problems. He wanted to find solutions. He began attending city council meetings and community forums, often staying late into the night to listen and speak. He discovered how bureaucracy and politics often stalled progress, how promises made during election seasons faded once officials were in office. One night, during a heated discussion about school funding, Jalen challenged a council member who argued the budget was as fair as possible. "How can you say that when our schools are falling apart and students have fewer resources than those in richer parts of town?" Jalen pressed. The council member's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We do what we can. But what about what should be done?" Jalen fired back. The room fell silent. As Jalen's activism grew, so did the resistance. Some saw him as a troublemaker, a young man stepping beyond his place. Rumors circulated, attempts were made to discredit his findings, and not everyone welcomed the spotlight he shone on uncomfortable truths. Yet he refused to back down. His family, particularly Charles Bennett, stood by him. "Keep pushing," Charles advised during one tense evening. "Change isn't pretty, it's a battle." At school, Jalen also found allies, students and professors who believed in the cause. They formed a coalition focused on raising awareness and advocating for policy changes. Together, they launched petitions, organized workshops, and held town halls. One of their most successful initiatives was a digital literacy program connecting college students with neighborhood youth, teaching essential skills to prepare them for the modern workforce. Jalen oversaw the project with fierce dedication, making sure the workshops remained accessible and relevant. Despite these victories, Jalen was haunted by a pattern he noticed in the data. Over the past 5 years, funding for programs aimed at helping at-risk youth, mentorship, after-school activities, counseling, had been systematically slashed. The cuts aligned disturbingly with rises in dropout rates and juvenile crime in his community. Jalen realized that the consequences were devastating. This revelation propelled him into action. He compiled a detailed report, drawing on his research and first-hand accounts. He presented the findings at a community meeting, his voice steady but urgent. "We cannot accept this as the status quo," he declared. "Our children deserve better." The room erupted in applause, but Jalen knew the fight was just beginning. He reached out to the local school board and city officials, demanding transparency and accountability. Some responded with vague promises. Others ignored him. Undeterred, Jalen sought media coverage, working with a local reporter who was eager to spotlight the issue. The story went viral, sparking wider public outrage and forcing officials to take notice. Through these efforts, Jalen learned that knowledge was power, but only if wielded strategically. He began to understand the complexities of politics and power, how deals were made behind closed doors, how competing interests often stalled progress, and how resilience was necessary to withstand pushback. Meanwhile, the pressure weighed on him, balancing activism, academics, community projects, and personal relationships stretched him thin. Late-night studying often followed long days at meetings and events. Yet, in quiet moments, he thought about Cameron, the boy whose life he had once saved. He thought about all the children like Cameron, vulnerable, hopeful, waiting for someone to stand up for them. Jalen's discoveries also revealed the cracks in his own assumptions. He had believed that education alone was the key to breaking cycles of poverty and violence. Now he saw that it was only part of the solution. He needed to address economic inequality, housing stability, mental health support, and community safety. His vision grew bigger, more complex. In those moments of reflection, Jalen felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than a personal journey. It was a movement, one that required courage, collaboration, and relentless pursuit of justice. But the more Jalen uncovered, the clearer it became that powerful interests were working to maintain the status quo. Corporations benefiting from low wages and lax regulations, politicians wary of upsetting donors, and bureaucrats resistant to change all formed a barrier. Jalen was now not just fighting for a scholarship or personal success, he was challenging entrenched systems. Yet, amid these challenges, he found hope. In every story shared by a parent, every smile from a child learning to read, every ally who joined the cause, he saw the seeds of transformation. Jalen was no longer the boy who stumbled upon a lost child on a cold street. He was a young man on the front lines of a battle for his community's future. And though the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with obstacles, Jalen understood that the first step was always to keep moving forward. By this stage, Jalen's journey had reached a critical crossroads. His relentless pursuit of justice and equity had begun attracting attention, both positive and ominous. His name was no longer just whispered in neighborhood corners or college hallways. It was spoken in city council chambers and political backrooms. But with this rising influence came the dark realities of power, manipulation, betrayal, and the cunning traps set to silence those who dared challenge the status quo. The invitation came quietly, wrapped in the kind of polished language that betrayed its true intent. Jalen was asked to meet Councilman David Reynolds in a private setting. Reynolds was a figure well known for his political savvy and connections, his reputation that of a kingmaker behind the scenes. To some, he was the key to unlocking city, resources, and political goodwill. To others, a gatekeeper who kept the marginalized out of the rooms where decisions were made. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jalen approached the meeting with cautious optimism. Perhaps this was the moment to bridge the gap between grassroots activism and institutional power. The meeting took place in a glass-paneled office overlooking the downtown skyline. The sterile atmosphere contrasted sharply with the rough edges of Jalen's neighborhood, where cracked sidewalks and faded murals told stories of resilience and neglect. Reynolds greeted him with a firm handshake and a practiced smile. "Jalen, it's good to finally meet you," Reynolds said smoothly. "I've heard impressive things." Jalen nodded, maintaining his composure. "Thank you for the invitation. I'm here because I want to see real change." Reynolds leaned back, exuding calm confidence. Change is complex. It requires balance, compromise, understanding the many stakeholders involved. Jalen's gut tightened. He had heard these words before. They were often the language used to temper idealism, to water down demands. Over the following weeks, Reynolds courted Jalen with calculated generosity. He introduced him to influential figures, offered support for community projects, and invited him to exclusive meetings. It was intoxicating. Finally, doors were opening that had long been slammed shut. Yet the closer Jalen got, the more he sensed the invisible strings attached. Reynolds's support seemed conditional, contingent on Jalen softening his approach and avoiding certain topics. At a community forum, Jalen raised concerns about the city's budget priorities, questioning why so little funding was allocated to his neighborhood's schools and social services. Reynolds listened politely, but steered the conversation toward feasible solutions and incremental progress. Whenever Jalen pressed for transparency or accountability, Reynolds changed the subject or dismissed it as political realities. Rumors began circulating. Some community members whispered that Reynolds's promises were smoke and mirrors, that his development plans would displace longtime residents in favor of corporate interests. Jalen's doubts grew. He confided in Charles Bennett, who had been a steady pillar of wisdom and support. "Politics is a chess game, son," Charles said. "Sometimes the pieces look like friends, but move in unexpected ways." The real test came when Reynolds invited Jalen to a closed-door meeting to discuss a city-backed revitalization plan for the East End. The meeting was held in a sleek conference room, where the walls were lined with glossy architectural renderings and data charts projecting future economic growth. Sitting around the table were city officials, real estate developers, and business executives, people whose interests often ran counter to those of the community. Jalen listened as they outlined plans for luxury condos, upscale retail, and commercial offices. The language was all about progress, investment, and job creation, but Jalen saw the unspoken cost: rising rents, displacement, and the erasure of the neighborhood's culture and people. When he voiced concerns about affordable housing and community input, the room's mood shifted subtly. One developer remarked, "Change requires sacrifice. Not everyone benefits equally." Jalen realized this wasn't just a meeting about development. It was a battleground where his community's future was being quietly auctioned off. Afterward, Reynolds approached him quietly. "You're passionate, and that's admirable," Reynolds said, "but you have to be pragmatic. Compromise is necessary if you want to get things done." Jalen felt the sting of that message. Compromise often meant betrayal. Back in the community, tensions mounted. Some residents were hopeful about new investments and jobs. Others feared being pushed out, losing their homes and history. Jalen found himself navigating between these conflicting realities, struggling to hold the community together. To complicate matters, cracks appeared within Jalen's own coalition. Maya, one of his closest allies, began acting distant and evasive. When Jalen confronted her, she was vague, avoiding his questions. The tipping point came when confidential plans and internal communications from the coalition were leaked to local media, sparking a scandal that jeopardized funding and public trust. Jalen was stunned and heartbroken. Someone within their ranks had betrayed them. After weeks of tension, Maya finally admitted the truth. She had been approached by a lobbyist connected to one of the major developers involved in the revitalization plan. They offered her financial incentives and promises of future opportunities in exchange for softening the coalition's opposition. Maya's betrayal cut deep, shaking the foundation of trust Jalen had worked so hard to build. Jalen grappled with a whirlwind of emotions, anger, disappointment, and the crushing weight of isolation. The very cause that had united them was now threatened from within. Desperate for guidance, Jalen turned to his mentors and elders in the community. "Betrayal is part of the struggle," Charles told him firmly. "But so is resilience. Learn from this. Be smarter." With renewed determination, Jalen called an emergency coalition meeting. He laid everything bare: the leak, the betrayal, the stakes. They agreed on new measures: vetting members more thoroughly, strengthening internal communications, and expanding outreach to voices beyond their usual circle. Elderly residents, small business owners, and grassroots activists. This renewed focus helped rebuild trust and strengthened their unity. The coalition recommitted to transparency and accountability, knowing their strength lay in community solidarity. But the traps were far from over. Reynolds and his allies continued their subtle campaign to control the narrative and dilute the coalition's influence. Jalen realized he couldn't rely on promises from politicians anymore. His power came from the people. He doubled down on grassroots organizing, knocking on doors, holding neighborhood meetings, and building alliances with local churches, youth groups, and advocacy organizations. One day, as he canvassed a block, known for its proud history of activism, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins shared stories of past fights for justice, of leaders who had been silenced, movements that had been crushed. Her words were a somber reminder that the battle Jalen fought was part of a long lineage. Jalen understood now that every victory invited new challenges. Every step forward was met with resistance. But with each trap and deception, his resolve hardened. He was no longer just a young man with a scholarship and a dream. He was a symbol of hope, a beacon for those who refused to be forgotten. The path ahead was uncertain and treacherous, but Jalen knew one thing clearly: to create lasting change, he had to keep fighting, smarter, stronger, and together. The City Hall chamber was a grand hall filled beyond capacity. The air inside felt heavy, a mix of anticipation, nervous energy, and the quiet hum of thousands of emotions boiling beneath the surface. Rows of chairs creaked under the weight of a diverse crowd. Community elders, local activists, young families, reporters, city officials, and the developers behind the controversial East End revitalization plan. Jalen Carter stood near the entrance, his breath shallow but steady. Today was the day he had been preparing for months, the day when everything he and his community had fought for would come to a head. The hearing would determine whether the plans to redevelop the neighborhood would move forward as proposed, or whether the voices of those who called East End home would be heard and heeded. Since first discovering the extent of the project, Jalen had thrown himself into this fight with every ounce of strength and conviction he possessed. He had spent long nights in his cramped apartment, studying zoning laws, drafting letters, meeting with neighbors, and mobilizing supporters. Every phone call, every meeting, every step had been building toward this moment. His mind flicked back to the early days when he first noticed the creeping changes. Luxury apartments going up near the edge of the neighborhood, rents rising. Inexplicably, old family businesses closing their doors. At first, it was easy to dismiss as progress, but soon it became clear this was a calculated push to displace the community, to erase a history and culture that had survived decades of neglect. Today, Jalen was no longer just a concerned resident. He had become a leader, a symbol of resistance and hope, and the stakes were higher than ever. Across the room, Councilman David Reynolds sat poised, a knowing smile faint on his lips. Reynolds was a man well-versed in politics and power, with connections reaching deep into the corridors of influence. He had long championed the development plan, promising prosperity and growth. But for many, including Jalen, Reynolds represented the very forces threatening their homes and lives. The hearing began promptly. The city council chair called the meeting to order and invited the developers to present their proposal first. The developer's presentation was polished and persuasive. Using high-definition renderings and sleek economic forecasts, they painted a vision of a revitalized East End, gleaming skyscrapers, bustling shops, and a flood of new jobs. "We're talking about transforming the neighborhood into a beacon of progress," the lead developer said confidently. "This project will bring millions in investment and lift the entire city's profile." But for Jalen and many others, these promises rang hollow. Behind the sparkling vision lay the harsh reality of rising rents, the erasure of community ties, and the displacement of families who had called East End home for generations. Then came the community's turn. One by one, residents rose to speak, their voices a chorus of lived experience and raw emotion. Mrs. Jenkins, a frail woman in her 70s, stepped forward, clutching a faded photograph of her late husband standing in front of their home. "I've lived here my whole life," she said, voice wavering but firm. "This neighborhood is my family's legacy. It's more than bricks and mortar. It's where children grow up, where we support each other, where memories are made." Her words resonated deeply with the crowd. A hush fell over the room as she described neighbors lost to gentrification, longtime friends forced to move miles away. Jalen watched her carefully, drawing strength from her courage. When it was his turn, He rose slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. He began not with anger, but with a story. The story of a neighborhood that had been marginalized, ignored, and undervalued for decades. He spoke of the rich, culture and resilience that defined East End, the artists who painted murals on crumbling walls, the musicians whose songs filled the streets on summer nights. Progress isn't about tearing down what makes us who we are, Jalen said, voice steady. It's about building on our strengths and creating opportunities for everyone, not just the wealthy few. His words echoed through the chamber, stirring a mix of applause and solemn reflection. But then came Councilman Reynolds' rebuttal. With practiced ease, Reynolds emphasized balanced growth and economic necessity. He spoke of the city's need to attract investment and create jobs, painting opposition as fear of change. He urged patience and compromise, claiming the plan included affordable housing quotas and community benefits. But many in the room knew those promises had been made before, promises that rarely materialized. The hearing dragged on, voices rising and falling like waves crashing against a stubborn shoreline. Local activists challenged developers on environmental impact, eviction, protections and transparency. Some young mothers spoke of their fears of losing affordable childcare and schools. Jalen sat quietly, absorbing every detail, knowing that winning this battle required more than passion. It required strategy and perseverance. Outside the chamber, the fight raged on. Supporters rallied, held vigils, and organized marches. Social media buzzed with hashtags and videos, drawing attention far beyond the city. But behind closed doors, political machinations threatened to undo months of hard work. Lobbyists and power players whispered deals and threats. Council members faced pressure to vote along party lines or accept campaign donations tied to the developers. Jalen grappled with moments of doubt. The system was daunting, seemingly rigged against those without money or influence. But surrender was never an option. The day of the vote arrived. The council chamber was packed again, this time with a heavier silence, one charged with tension and expectation. Council members delivered their statements, some siding with the community, others emphasizing economic growth. Finally, the vote was called. The result was a mix of victory and concession. The revitalization plan was approved, but with significant amendments championed by Jalen's coalition. Increased affordable housing mandates, stronger tenant protections, and the creation of a community oversight board. It was far from a total win, but it was a foothold. As the gavel fell, Jalen felt a surge of relief mixed with resolve. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The neighborhood's fate was still fragile, and the forces of displacement would not retreat quietly. Yet in that chamber filled with both supporters and opponents, something had shifted. A young man from East End had stood his ground against entrenched power and made a difference. As Jalen walked out of City Hall into the cool evening air, surrounded by cheers and embraces, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, and the fire of hope burning bright within him. This confrontation, the climax of his journey, was proof that courage, unity, and unwavering belief could challenge even the most daunting odds. And in moments like these, the future of a community, and perhaps a city, is forged. The morning sun poured through the cracked window of Jalen Carter's modest apartment, casting warm golden light over piles of documents, community flyers, and worn notebooks spread across the table. The city council's decision from the day before still echoed in his mind, a complex mixture of relief, cautious optimism, and the sobering knowledge that the fight was far from over. For months, Jalen had poured his heart and soul into the battle to protect the East End neighborhood. The amendments secured stronger tenant protections, mandated affordable housing units, and the establishment of a community oversight board were significant victories. Yet, he knew these wins were just first steps on a much longer path. The phone on his desk buzzed repeatedly, flooding him with messages and calls from neighbors, activists, and local leaders. Some messages were filled with gratitude, others with requests for guidance and support, as the community grappled with what came next. "Thank you, Jalen. You gave us hope when we thought none was left," read one text from Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who had spoken so bravely during the city hearing. Another was a voicemail from a tenant facing eviction, desperate for help navigating the new protections. Jalen leaned back in his chair, his eyes heavy from sleepless nights, but his spirit energized by the collective strength of his neighbors. The community's resilience had been his greatest source of inspiration throughout this journey. Despite the council's decision, gentrification's shadow still loomed over East End. New luxury apartments continued to rise on the neighborhoods. Fringes and rents were climbing steadily. Some landlords, unwilling to lose profits, found ways to skirt the new regulations, exploiting loopholes and intimidating tenants. Jalen was painfully aware that the forces pushing displacement were powerful and relentless. But the city's approval of amendments wasn't just a victory on paper. It was a turning point in a long struggle for justice and recognition. The creation of the Community Oversight Board marked a historic first for East End, a platform where residents could hold developers and city officials accountable. Jalen was appointed as one of its founding members, a role that brought with it both honor and heavy responsibility. The board's initial meetings were charged with tension. Developers attended with guarded smiles, city officials with cautious optimism, and residents with a mix of hope and skepticism. Jalen observed closely as discussions unfolded, realizing that meaningful change required not just legal measures, but ongoing vigilance and unity. During one particularly heated meeting, a young mother stood up to challenge a developer's plan to reduce affordable units. Her voice trembled, but her conviction was unshakable. "If we lose affordable housing here, where will my children grow up?" she asked, eyes scanning the room. "This isn't just about buildings. It's about families, history, and community." The words stirred a deep feeling in Jalen, a reminder that the stakes were not abstract, but deeply personal. Outside of formal meetings, grassroots organizing flourished. Neighborhood groups hosted workshops to educate residents on their rights. Tenant unions formed to resist unjust evictions, and cultural events celebrated the rich heritage of East End. Jalen threw himself into these efforts, balancing his role on the oversight board with volunteer work at the local community center. Mentoring young people became a source of joy and purpose, a chance to nurture the next generation's leadership. His life was far from easy. Juggling activism, work, and personal struggles often left him exhausted, but the gratitude of his community and small victories kept him going. Among his most unexpected allies was Marcus Williams, the father of the lost child Jalen had once saved. Marcus's journey mirrored the neighborhood's transformation from outsider to dedicated supporter. Initially distant from local issues, Marcus was deeply moved by Jalen's courage and the community's plight. He stepped up, using his business acumen and resources to support affordable housing projects and social programs. Their partnership wasn't always smooth. Some residents viewed Marcus's involvement with suspicion, wary of outside influence and potential ulterior motives. In a town hall meeting, an elder voiced these concerns bluntly. "We've been ignored by people like you for too long. Show us you're here for us, not just for headlines." Marcus listened carefully and responded with humility. He pledged to support the community's goals transparently and respectfully, emphasizing collaboration over control. Over time, trust grew between Marcus, Jalen, and the residents. Together, they launched initiatives that addressed both immediate needs and long-term sustainability. A cooperative affordable housing development, scholarships for youth, and preservation efforts for historic neighborhood landmarks. Still, Jalen never lost sight of the dangers that remained. Gentrification was a tidal wave, and while small victories had been won, the threat to the neighborhood's soul persisted. Late one night, a call from a concerned neighbor shattered the quiet. A building slated for redevelopment was reportedly pressuring tenants to leave illegally. Jalen sprang into action, rallying volunteers to monitor the site, document abuses, and report violations to authorities. Their vigilance thwarted an eviction attempt and sent a clear message that the community was watching. These moments of resistance underscored the reality that justice was not a single event, but a continuous fight. As seasons passed, the neighborhood evolved. Streets once littered and neglected now hosted vibrant markets. Local art adorned storefronts, and public spaces buzzed with activity. Yet through it all, East End's heart remained intact. A resilient community bound by shared history and collective strength. Jalen's transformation was profound. From a young student unsure of his place, he had grown into a leader whose voice carried far beyond the neighborhood. His story became a beacon of hope, proof that ordinary people, fueled by compassion and courage, could challenge systemic injustice. Reflecting on the journey, Jalen understood the profound impact of a single act of kindness. The moment he saved a lost child on a cold evening. That spark had ignited a movement that reshaped his life and his community. Despite the hardships, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The battle had not been easy, but the victories, both large and small, were priceless. As the sun set on East End, Jalen stood at the window of his apartment, watching families gather in the park below. Children laughed, elders shared stories on benches, and neighbors greeted one another warmly. In that scene of everyday life, he saw the true meaning of justice, a place where people could live, grow, and belong. The future remained uncertain, but Jalen faced it with unwavering hope and determination. Because victory was more than a moment in time. It was the ongoing work of building a just and compassionate community. The city of East End woke slowly beneath the soft glow of dawn, its streets humming quietly with the promise of a new day. For many, it was just another morning. But for Jalen Carter, it was a moment of reflection on a journey that had transformed not only his life, but the very heart of the neighborhood he loved. The worn sidewalks, the creaky stoops, the murals that decorated crumbling walls, all whispered stories of endurance, pain, and hope. East End was more than a place to live. It was a living, breathing community forged in the fires of struggle and solidarity. Jalen stepped outside his modest apartment, the early morning air crisp but filled with the warmth of familiarity. Faces smiled and nodded as he passed, neighbors who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him through the darkest days, their lives forever intertwined by a shared fight. He thought back to the nights filled with uncertainty, when the future seemed so fragile. The uncertainty had not disappeared, but it had been replaced with something more resilient, a collective determination to claim a better future. The cooperative housing development, a vision that once seemed almost impossible, had broken ground weeks ago. What had started as an ambitious dream now took physical shape, a beacon of stability amid the rising tide of displacement. Jalen remembered the ceremony vividly. The air was thick with emotion as elders spoke of their childhoods, families shared, stories of survival, and young people like Aaliyah, brimming with hope, pledged to carry the legacy forward. "This is not just about bricks and mortar," Jalen had said, voice steady despite the swell of emotion. "It's about reclaiming our dignity, our history, and our future." As the applause echoed through the crowd, Jalen felt a surge of gratitude for the community that believed, for the allies who stepped forward, and for the lost child whose cry had set this all in motion. But the fight was far from over. New challenges awaited as the forces of gentrification pushed ever closer. Proposals for luxury high-rises, upscale retail centers, and exclusive developments threatened to unravel the fragile progress. Jalen's days became a whirlwind of meetings, strategy sessions, and grassroots organizing. He worked alongside Marcus Williams, whose transformation from outsider to committed ally was a testament to the power of empathy and collaboration. Marcus, once viewed with suspicion by many, had proved his dedication through actions, funding, scholarships, supporting job training programs, and advocating for fair development practices. Their partnership symbolized the possibility of bridging divides between past and future, tradition and change. The community's vigilance paid off when a proposed luxury complex on the neighborhood's edge was forced to scale back its plans, including affordable housing units and funding for local infrastructure. Though it was a compromise, it reflected the growing influence of a united community refusing to be silenced. Jalen knew that sustainable change required more than legal victories. It demanded nurturing the next generation of leaders, fostering economic empowerment, and preserving cultural identity. He dedicated countless hours mentoring youth, sharing lessons from his own journey, from a student uncertain of his place to a leader whose voice carried weight. Among these young leaders was Aaliyah, a fierce and passionate teenager whose energy rekindled Jalen's own youthful fire. Under his guidance, she organized forums on civic rights, environmental stewardship, and community health. Together, they launched a neighborhood-wide initiative to revitalize local parks, transforming neglected spaces into vibrant hubs of activity and connection. These efforts breathed new life into East End, reinforcing the message that progress could be rooted in respect and inclusion. Jalen's role as a mentor extended beyond youth. He engaged with elders, business owners, and new residents, fostering dialogue that strengthened social fabric. At community meetings, he listened as people shared their fears, hopes, and ideas. His empathy and openness helped bridge generational and cultural divides. One evening, as the community gathered for a storytelling event, Jalen watched as voices from all walks of life wove a tapestry of shared experience and vision. A local artist unveiled a mural depicting East End's past and future, a powerful symbol of resilience and renewal. Jalen felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that this was their story, told through their own eyes. Yet he never forgot the origins of this journey. The night he found a lost child wandering alone, his decision to act sparking a movement that rippled through time. That single act of kindness became the seed of hope, nurturing a collective awakening. Despite the progress, Jalen remained acutely aware of the precarious balance they maintained. Economic disparities, political inertia, and systemic barriers were formidable opponents. The community center, once a dilapidated building, had become a sanctuary, a place for learning, healing, and organizing. Here, neighbors found support navigating legal challenges, accessing social services, and connecting with each other. Jalen often stayed late, working alongside volunteers, sharing stories and planning next steps. He knew that every small victory, every prevented eviction, every youth graduation, every community event was a brick building a stronger foundation. As seasons changed, so did East End. The streets were cleaner, the storefronts more vibrant, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air. Families gathered in parks, elders shared recipes and stories on stoops, and children played freely in spaces once deemed unsafe. Jalen's heart swelled with each sign of renewal. But the neighborhood story was not just one of survival. It was one of transformation. Inspired by the progress, local schools integrated community history and civic engagement into their curricula, empowering students to take pride in their heritage and roles as active citizens. Jalen worked with educators to develop mentorship, programs connecting students with professionals, artists, and activists. These connections opened doors previously closed to many. One afternoon, Jalen received an invitation to speak at a citywide forum on urban development and social justice. As he prepared, he reflected on the lessons learned, the power of empathy, the importance of unity, and the necessity of persistence. On stage, he shared East End's journey candidly, highlighting both triumphs and ongoing struggles. His words resonated deeply, inspiring others to believe that change was possible even in the face of daunting challenges. Back home, the community celebrated the recognition, but Jalen reminded them that the work continued. Together, they launched new initiatives: sustainable small business grants, cultural heritage preservation, and mental health support programs. Jalen's vision expanded beyond neighborhood boundaries, advocating for citywide policies addressing systemic inequities. He forged alliances with other grassroots leaders, creating networks of mutual support and shared advocacy. Through these connections, East End's story became a beacon, proof that collective action rooted in compassion and courage could reshape realities. Amid the progress, Jalen maintained moments of quiet reflection. Walking the neighborhood at dusk, he found solace in the familiar sights and sounds, the gentle hum of conversations, the flickering porch lights, the scent of home-cooked meals. He thought of the lost child, now safe and surrounded by love, of Marcus, who had become a true partner, and of every neighbor who had stood firm. These memories fueled his resolve. Jalen knew that the future remained uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. With hope as their compass and unity as their strength, East End would continue to rise. In this new chapter, The story was no longer about one person's journey, but about a community's unwavering commitment to justice and belonging. And for Jalen Carter, that was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.